I watched a really obscure movie, and yeah, so obscure that it was only seen by a bit over 100, and there's there's barely any information about it online. Either way, I liked it. I mean, I pretty much I rated it personally even higher than say Shaun of the Dead. I mean, why not? It's just because something is popular doesn't mean it's better, of course. Um, it's slightly different. I mean, it's described as a dramedy, but it doesn't have that much comedy. Yeah, it doesn't quite. What it does have, though, is an interesting sort of trip into the psyche, I suppose. What's interesting is that it has the same title as a really old sci-fi. In fact, one of the earliest sci-fis called A Trip to the Moon. I think inspired by Jules Verne. Yeah, not quite the same though at all, but sort of similar. Well, I mean, the original Trip to the Moon from 1902. That's over 100 years ago. Doesn't quite try to imply, from what I remember at least, that it's set in the mind of someone it knows. Tries to make the audience believe that it's happening or whatever, sci-fi, try to, suspense of disbelief and everything. Yeah, no, this was interesting. It combines reality, solid reality, and the need to escape sometimes. It doesn't quite go very far in terms of sort of this sort of thing. Like this it has a similar sort of fundament sort of as A Beautiful Mind, even in terms of it's implied that the protagonist is psychotic in this sense, but doesn't quite go that far. It's more about sort of resolving a sort of PTSD issue. The ending is quite nice. How it all happens, you don't quite sort of return to reality in the end, and somehow without even assuming anything, because the family does indicate that they're just playing along. But then as time goes on, then at the ending is quite remarkable. As time goes on, yeah. In his own mind at least, they're floating and everything, which is quite impossible, obviously. But yeah. But then the very ending there with uh, Iris, somehow she's called Iris. Yeah. It makes it seem like it's happening. I mean, she doesn't seem like she's playing along, but she already knew that he was playing such a trip and everything. So yeah, it's interesting. How it doesn't quite it's not very explicit as to what's happening, or goes very far when it comes to the science of psychosis, presumably, like say A Beautiful Mind does. But it goes quite well into fantasy. I mean, it is ultimately fantastic. I thought it might be somewhat sci-fi, but it's not really. It's more fantasy, I suppose. Um, Even though actually Trip to the Moon isn't labeled as sci-fi either. The original Trip to the Moon, is it? Short action adventure. It is essentially still one of the earliest sci-fi, isn't it? Yes. So it's quite something how and you never know whether the spaceship, the so-called spaceship, is you never know what's real, what's not. And at one point, his father asked him about the materials, so presumably he was looking at it as well. one was assumed they were still in this room with the egg carton things, but I don't know. Then what it is if he's asking about the material, then were they in that room or were they really somewhere else? Where he really built something like that? Was it in his imagination or wasn't it? So yeah, it implies all these questions, which is interesting really, as a backdrop to this realize sort of act. Yeah, I suppose realization of the PTSD sort of thing. I don't know, but one doesn't quite know whether PTSD is related to psychosis, so one assumes that it might be, but is still not sure, you know. So yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, it's it is interesting in what it is, but at any rate, I mean, it's yeah. It reminded me of, and yes, I think it is more popular, Moon, and its popularity might have something to do with the fact that it's directed by um, the son of Bowie. hmm Um, quite much more well known, huh? It is 11 years old now, but more than a quarter of a million have rated it, as opposed to over 100, and yet quite similar in a way. As opposed to with Moon, it does make you think that they really did go to outer space. It's not just entirely in the imagination, but similarly, one doesn't know what is real, what isn't. There's a certain, identity crisis going on, so it's sort of similar in this sense. Of course, it's acted by more well-known people, so it's one of those things, where the more people are well-known, the more well-known they're. Never mind. At any rate, they're quite similar. It doesn't quite have though any. So whereas Moon is more individual, it's more about the individual, nothing else. I mean, he literally. Well, I don't know. I suppose it would be a spoiler, but yeah. This on the other hand, though, a trip to the moon as opposed to just Moon is more about more people rather than just an individual. These two primarily, yeah, but also his family and possibly just a bit, his doctor and such. But yeah, it's sort of like a combination then between A Beautiful Mind and Moon. Of course, A Beautiful Mind didn't have any astronomy; it had maths, which this didn't quite have as much. No, it didn't really. Anyway, this is about not quite the protagonist in Moon, along with A Beautiful Mind, are pretty much adults, so it's slightly different. But yeah, I liked whatever it was really. I liked how it presented itself. I thought it was interesting. The questions it asked. Yeah, doesn't quite have the same thrill that A Beautiful Mind has. It's not quite the same similar function, but similarly in A Beautiful Mind, he stops having medication as well. So in that sense, it's similar. We assume there is psychosis going on, so yeah. Whereas in Moon, that's never explicit though. One assumes there's something going on, but it's never explicit at least. Whereas here, it sort of is. Well, psychosis as a word isn't quite mentioned, as opposed to A Beautiful Mind, where I think it is, or schizophrenia or such. But yeah, it's interesting. This is more fantasy than sci-fi though, and Moon is more sci-fi, and A Beautiful Mind is more drama, I think, than fantasy. But yeah, they're all interesting movies, definitely.